So, welcome. I'd mentioned it'd be cool if we could figure out a way to do a little map and have virtual pins that we could stick in. We'll have to work on that for some future events, just because of the diversity of people from all over the place. So it's kind of cool. I'm just going to click on the camera here. There we go. Good morning, everybody. I just returned from about 10 days down in Central America, Nicaragua. It wasn't a relaxing holiday. It was a very active trip, hence the lack of tan. And I'm still getting lots of glare from those lights above me, but hopefully this will all proceed well. The topic today is going to be on job retention, building on success, and experience. And so job retention, of course, when you look at working with or helping people go through this process of achieving employment, it goes through a number of steps or phases, and sometimes we get through that initial discovery stage, the engagement stage. We go through that job finding process. We manage to find some good links, and then and the person becomes employed, and we can celebrate that success. But then one of the things we have to be careful about is that things are not necessarily finished. And in fact, the post-employment period or post-starting that first job or that job is very a crucial time, because there are a number of things that can go wrong at that point. There's a number of pitfalls or roadblocks, speed bumps, whatever you might want to call it. But there are things that can happen that can put that new job in jeopardy. And so we want to be anticipating and trying to plan for those things ahead of time, of course. And a lot of the work that we've already talked about through that discovery and engaging process and the job development process, we're going to set ourselves up and the new employee up more for success. But there's no perfect situation in most cases. There's going to be a bit of follow-up or supports after the fact that will need to be done. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And really, this session is going to be sort of a reflection on a number of experiences that we've actually had in practice. And so looking at what are some of the main areas or categories of roadblocks or issues that have come up for us over the past 20 years. Because we see those come up over and over. And so the good thing is you can prepare for them. You can anticipate some of them. And that's what I hope to be able to do today. Then we're also going to look at some strategies that people can use, and I'll illustrate those with a few examples and case studies along the way. So just to go ahead and get started, our session objectives for today, to outline and identify some key issues regarding job retention and some possible support needs that go along with those issues. Understand the important roles that each person on the team plays in relation to long-term supports and success. Review some common pitfalls that happen and common ones from our experience when it comes to maintaining employment for people, and here's some examples of successful job retention stories through case studies. And so how we address some of those pitfalls successfully, and the lessons that we learned as a result. So job retention, some of the key issues, and going through preparing for this and writing out, looking at the whole spectrum of things that can happen after the person becomes employed. There seem to be four distinct categories or areas that were coming to the forefront. And so these are the four that I've put on the slide here. One of the first and starting sort of paramount key issues is to really make sure that we have a strong foundation. The stronger the foundation that the job starts off with, and so that goes to all of the prep work, the preliminary work, the development stuff, all of those things. The stronger that work can be, the stronger the quality of that work, the more stable the job will likely be. And so I'll give you a few examples when we look specifically at that key issue. The next one is natural supports, and natural supports are extremely important. We have limited, in many cases, limited amounts of hours and limited number of staff to work with people. And so when we come to the person having successfully been employed and they're now on the job, that's often when we think, okay, now we can go on to the next person and and start to pull back on our time. And ideally that would be the case. And so one of the ways to help us fade ourselves out of the picture is to make sure that there's some natural supports within the workplace that can pick up on some of those support needs on an ongoing basis. So I'll give a few examples of what natural supports might look like, how you might nurture them, and that sort of thing. Team communication is extremely important as far as job retention goes, because it doesn't end with the job. With that employment letter or the first working day, the team still is important, and especially when you're working with folks with mental health issues, there's a number of key people in their lives that are important, and so we need to make sure that the information is still flowing so that if something starts to come up, it can be addressed very quickly and with the right people. And so I'll talk a little bit about that and why it's so important. And then maintenance needs to be expected. I think that we need to prepare for it. We need to anticipate it and expect it. There's actually very few cases where the person becomes employed and there's never ever an issue again after that. So we, especially in that first sort of critical 3 to 6 month period, and even a bit longer in some cases, we need to expect that there's going to be a need for us to be checking in and doing some maintenance and support. Even if it's just very basic sort of support, and in some cases we almost get the feeling from the employee and the workplace, the employers, that they don't want to see us anymore. I mean, we've already been involved, we've already gone through and done all the setup, we've done some of that initial training, and they're like, okay, we can take it from here. And so sometimes the employment person actually is getting the feeling like they're not wanted and they don't need to keep calling back. And in fact, employers will even tell you straight out, you don't need to keep checking, everything's fine. We'll call you if there's a problem. And in fact, in many cases, we will tell employers as we're about to fade out or fade back our supports, if there's anything at all, any problems, any issues, don't hesitate to give us a call. The difficulty with that is that they often don't call. Even if they say they'll call, they often don't. And in fact, when you end up hearing that there's a problem is when it's at the point where the person is being let go or things are just so sort of far beyond being salvageable. And that's certainly not going to be the ideal situation. That's where those maintenance check-ins and follow-ups can be extremely important. Even if people feel like everything is going along fine, it's important to do. So looking at, I guess this would be a good time to throw in our first poll, and I wanted to just poll people and see, have you ever been involved in trying to help salvage a person's job once it was already in jeopardy? So how many of you, whether it was a job you developed or somebody else did or the person found on their own, how many of you have been called in to try to help salvage a job once it's already in jeopardy? All right, it looks like a fair number of you have been in that situation. The ones that haven't yet, it may just be that you haven't gotten to that point yet, but it might be something that you're dealing with in the future. And we may, of course, have some managers or administrators on that wouldn't be directly involved in that anyways. So looking at that, so a fairly high number, 47% out of the answers recorded, people that have been involved in having to go in and trying to help salvage a person's job once it's already in jeopardy. So the good news is that from those numbers, I think that we'll be able to see that a lot of the things that I'll be mentioning, I think people will probably be able to relate to. And so one of the things that we learn is that as unfortunate as it is to have to go in and deal with some problems or crises after a job has been started, we often learn some really valuable lessons. So there is a silver lining. A lot of the things that we've learned over the years that I'll be talking about today have been learned because of experiences of us having to rush in to try to salvage a job that was sort of on the rocks. So going back to those key points, and the first one being the strong foundations. Looking at our job development process, which was the topic of the last webinar, the more information that we can secure, the more detail that we can put into the start of a person's job, the better. So, for example, things like the terms of the job. Make sure that it's very clear. There's nothing up for debate or question as far as the start time, the hours, the schedule, the job duties themselves, when reviews will take place. All those kinds of things are very important. What about time off? Has that been arranged specifically? If the person might need some kind of accommodations around health issues, where they might need some additional time off, those things are better to deal with right at the start, if it's possible, than trying to go backtrack afterwards when they're already becoming a problem. Changes to duties is one that we've found is an important one to sort of talk about and put on the table right at the start, because in the typical world, somebody will get hired for a job. You'll have a job description, you think you know what your job is, and then lo and behold, within a month or 2 months, things change. There might be staffing issues, there might be changes to the workloads, there might be changes in key staff, where job duties are shuffled. So those things can happen, and for many people, they might have the ability to deal with that, but sometimes for the folks that we're supporting, even those small changes can be big. And so in some cases, what we do is just in anticipation of that, if we learned from the discovery process that those kinds of changes could be difficult, we'll actually talk up front with the employer about that, where we say, okay, you guys have a 3-month probationary period or trial period, training period. Can we all agree that we're going to keep the basic job duties consistent for that period of time? The other thing is that if the job duties change, could we have an agreement right up front that if they're anticipating a change in job duties, that the employment support person will be called in and be part of that discussion. Just because we know as the employment support person all of the work that it took behind the scenes to get this person prepared for the job duties that they started with. The employer might not have the same understanding of that. And so it would be important for us to be part of the team if job duty changes are going to be occurring. We usually like to try to say, let's keep it stable and consistent and not change anything for the first 3 to 6 months. If it has to happen, then make sure that the team is part of it. So that can be set up right at the very start, and it's easier to do it that way in our experience than to try to go back in after the change has already been made and maybe the person is already starting to feel a bit anxious or uncomfortable, or that their job has been disrupted, and then going back to the employer and saying, okay, can we sort of pull back and not have a lot of changes? So good, clear job development is really key. Clear agreements in writing. I mean, using a customized approach, you would typically have like a written job description that's sort of customized to the person, and those can be very helpful. And when it's in writing right from the start, one area where we found this can be super helpful is if there's if anyone's unclear of the arrangements that were made at the start, if there's any change in management or direct supervisors, they might not have been part of those initial discussions. And so going back and having that written document or agreement around the job duties and the terms of employment can be super helpful. A lot of times, I mean, sometimes businesses, depending on the type of business it is, they'll be very organized. They'll have a lot of policy and procedure in place, and that will all be spelt out very, very clearly. But small businesses or a lot of other businesses, they don't have that same degree of documentation in place. So if you can be prepared to try to help implement that at the start, it can just make everyone's life a lot easier for maintenance and follow-up purposes. Then there's preparation and rehearsal in advance. because a lot of times and this can be done off-site. This can be done in the employment person's office. It can be done in a comfortable space outside of the workplace ahead of the first day, and even for ongoing for that first sort of critical month or 2 months. You can do some debriefing, some preparation. As an example for preparation for the first day, we've probably the person will have already seen the workplace, met people there. That will have all happened in that job development stage. But there's a whole lot of things that we might often take for granted that we do automatically in preparing for things. And so just think about all of those little tasks that you need to go through at the start of your workday. All of the little things that you need to do to be ready to work on time and be prepared and functioning. And so there's probably a lot more specific individual tasks than we even realize, and we just do them out of habit. And so if the person hasn't been in the habit yet of going to work on a regular basis, that would be a good thing to rehearse with them. So right down to things like what time are you going to go to bed the night before so that you can wake up on time. How are you going to wake up? Do you have an alarm? Do you have a backup? That's really important because you don't want to end up having a malfunction with your alarm clock on the very first day. If you use your cell phone, what happens when the battery dies or it loses power or the ringer isn't working? So is there a backup plan around that? And then just little things like all of the steps that you need to go to get to work. So what are you going to be wearing on the first day? What kind of footwear do you have? What's your transportation plan to get to the job? What are you going to do about food? If there's a meal break, are you taking something with you? Are you going to get something there? How's that going to work? Are you going to need any money for that? Who are the people that you're going to be seeing or making contact with as you first come into your job that first day? And who do you need to see, and what are those first steps that you need to do to get started with the job? That whole routine can be very important. So just as a couple of examples to illustrate, especially these last 2 points, the clear agreements in writing. I can think of one big box store that's located in many communities. Excuse me. And we had an individual, a couple of people actually get hired in the store shortly after they opened in our community. And of course there was the manager. But within that first year that this big box store was in our community, the manager actually changed 3 times. And so there was actually a considerable amount of work that was done because one of the 2 new employees, it was a very customized job. So it wasn't the typical big box off-the-shelf position. We actually had been able to negotiate with them, and so there were some modifications to the typical position for this person that were very important for their own needs. It worked out very well. The original manager was quite happy and satisfied with the arrangements and understood the reasons behind the accommodations that were made and the reason why the job description was different. But of course, when a new manager comes in, they're coming in, they're often coming in to, they want to straighten things out, they want to get things in order, get things running smoothly. They could be a new manager that's very by the book. And this actually happened when the new manager came in. They looked at this position and they said, "This isn't right. This isn't what this position usually involves." And so they see it as an anomaly, as something that's not following sort of the norm, and they don't have the value of all of the information around how that was set up, because all that work was done with the manager who's now gone. And so that's where the written documentation can be really helpful, and so when that position starts to be questioned, and this in fact happened with us, where the person was actually on the verge of losing their job if they couldn't follow the typical or the normal job description. So we were able to go in and pull out this customized job description and explain very clearly all of the points as to why this was put in place and what the arrangements were, and that did help satisfy the person. We were able to show the value of having this person there. They were doing a good job, and so that was very helpful as well. When we look at preparation and rehearsal, I mean, one analogy that comes to my mind, I've just been on a lot of airplanes recently, and I do travel quite a bit as it is. And so one thing that I do all the time is preparation and rehearsal for flights. And so if you think the last time that you've traveled on an airplane, think about all of the steps that you had to almost backwards chain from the time you took off in the airplane. So here's an example of the process that I go through on a regular basis. I have to think the day before. Okay, first of all, what time does my flight leave? So let's say it leaves at 8 o'clock in the morning. Then I need to think, okay, that means I have to check in at what time? An hour before, so that's 7 a.m. So if I have to check in at 7, how long do I have to leave to get to the airport? Now, the benefit for me being in a small community like Terrace is that I only have to leave 15 or 20 minutes early to get to the airport. And so but for somebody in the city, you may need to allow a lot more time for that. If that means that I have to leave about 6:40 in the morning to allow 20 minutes to get to the airport, just in case I have to slow down going up the airport hill, that means that I need about how long to get ready? Probably an hour and 10 minutes is good enough. Have a couple cups of coffee, get all ready to go, make sure I packed everything. So that's taking us backwards on this timeline to, okay, then if I need an hour and 10 minutes to get ready, what time do I have to actually wake up? 5:30 in the morning. Okay, and so if I have to wake up at 5:30 in the morning, that's a little bit earlier than what I'm used to. And so what time do I need to go to bed to make sure I'm capable of waking up and functioning at 5:30 in the morning? So instead of the usual bedtime of like 11 o'clock, I'm going to make sure I'm in bed by 10. So that backwards chaining and just going through that series of steps, I find myself I do it usually in my head. I don't usually have to write out the plan or anything like that, but I do it in my head, and I usually have to do it more than once. I have to kind of go through that process, those steps, more than once, just so that I'm solid and confirmed as to exactly what time I need to be doing what. And so I do that. I double, triple check the alarms. I usually have a backup, especially if it's an early flight, because in the winter, I mean, you could have a power outage or whatever. And so those are the steps that I go through when I'm getting ready for a flight. You could compare that to the first day of work for somebody that you're supporting. Once you start to do that task analysis and break it down, there's actually a number of things that you need to go through, or steps, and each one of those represents an area where there could be something that goes wrong. And so that's where that practice and rehearsal and preparation in advance can be very helpful. And so looking at, we've done that on a number of occasions where before the first day of work, maybe the day before, we have the person come into our office and we just go through a whole recap. Okay, let's lay out the timeline, let's lay out the plan, what's it going to look like? It seems to be really reassuring to folks because, of course, somebody who's starting a new job is going to be probably a bit anxious anyways. And when you're already anxious, that's when little things can become bigger things. Looking at the next key point, natural supports. Natural supports are really important. Natural supports are where we identify some key people in the workplace that we call our helpful people. And so who are those helpful people, those problem solvers, those go-to people within the workplace that we need to know? Probably within your own workplace, you have an idea already of who you go to for what issues. So sometimes it's not the same person. In a small organization, maybe you have one go-to person, that person that just has all the answers. But in a larger company, it's probably going to be different people. So just as an example, if the new employee has a question about payroll, because that could very well come up in the first month of work, who do they go to for payroll? That may be a particular person. If they have an issue around their schedule, which could also happen in that first starting month or months, do they go to someone different around the schedule than they do for the payroll? And so, and then their direct supervisor, as far as the job tasks and job duties, that might be a separate person again. So really making sure that we're really clear on who are those go-to people for what purposes. The other issue that can often come up is that you set up the go-to person, but what happens when they're not there? That can really throw a wrench into things for people. And so if the go-to person isn't there and there isn't a backup plan, then sometimes things will start to fall apart. Either the issue just won't get addressed, or the person will take it upon themselves to go ahead and do what they think is best. And so it's always good to have a backup person identified, because people are going to be either away or busy or whatever. Looking at the one example from a case study that illustrates this well is that there was a gentleman who he was working at an automotive shop, and it was his first week on the job. We'd done lots of preparation. He was very nervous about it, but things were going reasonably well. The support person was trying to sort of fade themselves out of the picture, because he was doing quite well, and they didn't want to be hanging over him or making him uncomfortable or stand out. And so they were getting him started, but then sort of pulling back and leaving the workplace and then coming back and checking in later. What they ended up finding out is that they happened to come back on purpose around when the coffee break or lunch break time would have been, and they saw this fellow in his overalls with his prepared lunch or snack that he had, but he was sitting out in the customer service area of this business. And it struck the employment support person as a bit odd that he would be sitting out there having his snack or his lunch. And so they just kind of casually brought up the issue or the question, and they asked him, and it just turns out that he was a bit nervous about being in the staff room with other staff, because he hadn't yet met everybody, and so there were staff that were coming in there that he didn't know, and he wasn't sure sort of socially just how to sort of break the ice, so to speak, with them. And so what our support person did was just said, oh, okay, come on, let me, that's something I can help you with, so why don't we just go head over to the staff room now, and we'll deal with that. And so he felt a lot more comfortable with the employment support person, because they'd had a relationship built up through this whole process. And so the two of them went into the staff room. It wasn't unusual for the employment support to be there, because they had been very involved in the setup. So people in the business were used to seeing that person there. And the employment support person just made a point of making introductions, making sure that he got names of people, that people knew who he was, and just breaking the ice, so to speak, for him. And so once that happened, he was much more comfortable, and the employment person actually followed up for a couple of days after that to make sure that they went at that break time, just to make sure that he was still comfortable going into the break room as opposed to sitting out in the front. Nobody had done anything, and I think that this had been gone on for a couple of days. And not that it was necessarily a problem, but it was just a bit odd. It was unusual. Coworkers would have seen that and not been sure what to do about it. And even the supervisors, they might have just thought, oh, that's a bit odd, but maybe it's something that he needs to do. So nobody was sort of going out of their way to, correct him or give him any directions. And so I think it was a good thing to have addressed right at the beginning. And had the staff not been going in to do that follow-up checkup, they probably wouldn't have noticed it right away. So it kind of supports that whole idea. So looking at backup supports and understanding the different roles for different people, just that alone can be very confusing for somebody. And I know the analogy that I use is working in a small agency, like the one that I work in for the most part. There's only a few people, so there's not a lot of go-to people. When I started teaching up at the college, it's a much larger organization, and so really there's different people for different jobs, and they're all over the place, spread out across the campus and in different campuses, and so it can be quite an ordeal just to get that all straight. If you can help facilitate those natural supports in the very early stages, the sooner the better. That can be really useful for people. Usually there will be a couple that we miss in our best intentions. We can't always cover everything in that job setup, the job development stage, and some things we just don't know until the job actually starts. And so that's why those follow-up supports are really crucial, because those things will come up and all of a sudden there's a person that we didn't know was a go-to person, or as the job starts to play out, there's a coworker or another staff person that just naturally sort of takes a liking to this new employee and is a really helpful person. All right, the next one is around team communication. And team communication is super important throughout the process. We've talked about this topic in the other sessions when we were looking at the discovery and engagement stage, that initial development stage. Also during the job development, how the team communication can be very important, and who you know and different helpful people. But as the person is now in the job, this doesn't end. And in fact, there can, because of the fact that the employment support person is often at this point starting to fade out their involvement and not be as directly hands-on involved on a day-to-day basis, the communication becomes even more important, because if something starts to go off, during the discovery stage, you're there with the person a lot, and so it's much easier for you to see those things. In the follow-up stage, after the job is started, that can be a real issue. So for example, if they have any supports at home, if they're in a residential program, or if they live on their own but they have some support, or if they live at home with their parents, these other people that are supportive to them are going to be really key to alert the job seeker or the employment support person if there's anything starting to develop, any potential issues that might impact the job. Sometimes the employment specialist or employment support person is going to be very tuned into those things, but the parent or the life skills support or the mental health counselor, they might not be, it might not be quite at the top of mind for them. And so the employment support person really needs to reinforce with each of the team players, okay, the person started their job now, here's some of the big red flags or issues that we want to really watch for. If we start to notice any of these things, or if you start to notice any of these things, and there might just be a handful of issues, like their sleeping patterns are changing dramatically, they're starting to take on a lot of extra stuff, there's any real changes in behavior, that sort of thing. Those are some of the things that we want that team to be tuned into so that they can alert the employment support person at the earliest signs that those things might be happening. So job stability should be seen as very important for everybody, and it can have a whole lot of ripple effects across the person's life. If they're stable in their job, there's a good chance that you're going to see positive sort of ripples spreading into their home life and their social life and other areas. And so it really does have a big impact. The opposite, of course, can also happen. If things start to go wrong at work, then that can have an impact on all the other areas of life. Also, if things start to go wrong at home or go off at home, that can definitely impact the job. So all of those communication points are going to be super important. Small issues can become very big issues quickly, and so everyone on the team needs to know when those things are coming up. Looking at one of the things that we often look at is that the communication agreements or protocols or consents, those really should be put in place right at the very start. So before the job even happens, even in that discovery stage, when you're identifying your helpful people, I think that that's a really good time to actually put in a specific protocol and say, okay, after the person gets a job, we need to continue to communicate, so here's how we're going to do that. And make sure that the person is in agreement, that they're okay with the team communicating even after the job. The reason why I mentioned that, putting those protocols and consents in place right at the very beginning, is that often it's a lot harder to pull those together quickly when the job starts falling apart. So if there's issues afterwards, it's going to be a lot harder to pull those protocols and consents together. So do it right at the very beginning as part of the job development process or the discovery process. That will make everyone's life a lot easier when it comes to actually dealing with it after the job starts. Maintenance needs to be expected, as I mentioned. Things are going to happen. We need to anticipate that they will. Of course, prevention is always best. That's what we're going to be focusing on. All of that work that you did in the discovery and the job development stage is all prevention focused. We're looking at setting up the best possible job, but we also need to make sure that we're preparing for things to happen. When we think about timelines, as far as like when can we actually sort of call it quits and end our support, that's a very individualized thing based on the person. I think that it's safe to say that the first 6 months are super crucial with any new job, but I don't think that we can automatically have like a 6-month cutoff. It's something where it's going to really depend on the person. I think that one measurement that we've used in our own practice is really that 6-month mark, and so up to the 6 months, we're doing fairly regular checks. We might do a couple times a week for the first month or 2 months. Then we might fade back to once a week for a few months, and maybe down to once a month after that. But we really, even though everything seems to be going fine, we want to make sure that that door is open. And keep in mind that even if people say that they're going to phone, they often don't. And that works both for the new employee and for the employer. And so we need to be proactive, anticipate that things will come up, and be in there to deal with them and catch them at the earliest point. So some of the common pitfalls. This is our experience-based examples with regards to job retention. And as I said, that silver lining. The bad news is if you have to deal with a job that's in jeopardy after it's started, it can be a real stressful and unfortunate situation, a bit panicky. But the good news is we almost always learn what we don't want to do next time, or what we're going to make sure we ask about or check off for the next job that we support. So doing some of the common ones that we've come into, again, looking at all of these examples from case studies, there seem to be 4, again, common areas of job retention pitfalls. And so these are the 4 that I've listed here. The first one is, and for those of you, because in that first poll, there was a large number of you, over 40%, that have actually experienced having to go in and deal with a retention issue. And so I think that you'll probably relate to these 4, and maybe one of these 4 was the issue that the person you were supporting had. And so looking at the first one, I'm doing great, time to take on more. So the person who's doing really well in their job, and they in fact are, and so that empowers them, it makes them feel strong and capable and ready to take on the world. But in fact, if they actually try to take on the world at that point, things could start to fall apart. Major life changes. Okay, now I've got the job, it's stable, I'm doing good, everything's great. Time to move, or time to buy a car, or time to get in a new relationship. Some of those major changes, if they are happening, within that first month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, it can really impact the job and the stability of the job. Another common one, I think, is from our experience at least, is the person who they're 2 months into a new job, everything's going really well, in part because of the supports and all of the efforts that you put into securing the job. But 2 months in, the person is now acting like or feeling like they don't need support. I'm doing fine. It's been 2 months. You don't need to keep calling me. You don't need to keep checking on me. I don't need your support anymore. Thank you very much. I'll handle it from here. If it's only 2 months in, there's a chance that some of those issues may arise, and in fact they will need some support. And so it can be a tricky one to deal with, because on one hand, it's a voluntary service. Likely the person has the right to not have your support. But on the other hand, when things happen, if you're not there to help them out, then they could put the person's job into jeopardy. And then some work ethic issues. This is something that comes up, and I've got a collection of them that I want to give you examples of, and we'll see if you've run into any of those with people that you've been supporting. So let's look at that first one. I'm doing great. Let's take on the world. This is what the pitfall. And here's a couple of examples of common ones that we've seen in our experience. Somebody gets a part-time job and they're doing really well at it, so a month, 2 months, 3 months in, they decide, all right, I'm ready for another part-time job. And so they actually start to go out and look. And from our experience, sometimes they're empowered enough that they're actually going out and doing that on their own. So they're not even going through the employment person. They're just going out now with their confidence and getting a second job or another job. And so that's happened on more than one occasion, and so it's one that you want to be aware of and sort of watch out for. We usually try to address that right in the beginning, even before the job starts, and try to get some agreement from the person as to, let's give it a good 6 months before we have any major changes, such as, and then we go through the list of things that might happen. Another example of taking on more would be not just a second job, but maybe more hours at their current job. So maybe they started off not quite full-time, but they started off part-time, and they're doing really well with part-time, and so in a short period, they decide that they're ready to take on more hours. Often if an employee is doing really well and they're not working to their perceived capacity, an employer will notice that and will automatically start to offer them more hours. And for a lot of people, that's a good thing. But for the person that you've supported to get this job, it might be too soon still. I mean, they might not be stable enough. And even though it seems to be going well, if we put on too much too soon, it could throw things into chaos. And then another one is more job duties. So taking on new tasks, new job duties. They're doing really well at the ones you started off with, and so the assumption is, well, if they're doing great at this, then why not give them some more? So let's see if they can start doing this, or let's see if we can add this into their job, and the person may feel comfortable doing that because they're feeling very confident with the success of the job to date, and so they might say yes when the employer gives them the option of taking on some more duties. It's not that that can never happen, because some people are able to do that. But our preference would always be that that happens in a planned way, and that the employment support person who was involved in doing all of the setup and the training for the original job duties could be involved in any additional job duties, especially within the first sort of 3 to 6 months of the job. So just to give you an example of this, we have a young man, we'll call him Ben. And Ben was working at a local hotel restaurant business, and he had a history we learned in the discovery process that he had a history of employment breakdowns, and usually it seemed to happen within the first 3 months. He was actually very good at getting jobs on his own. He could find a job. He just had a real hard time keeping a job past the 3-month mark. And it struck our employment staff as very curious because he had quite a list of jobs that he'd started that had all broken down really within that first 3-month period. And so they had some real in-depth discussions about this during that discovery and engagement process. And our employment support person really tried to get to the bottom of, what is it that was causing these jobs to fall apart in a relatively short time frame. To the best of their abilities, what they came up with was that they figured that it was because he had a pattern of taking on too much too soon, and so when he took on too many duties, he would start to feel a bit overwhelmed, a bit anxious. He'd start to call in sick for work. That wouldn't go well with the employer, who was relying on him now, and so then there would be this tension starting to happen. As soon as that ball started rolling, it seemed like things would inevitably start to unravel and fall apart for this person. And so this had been Ben's pattern. We knew this when we helped start him in this job at the local hotel and restaurant. And so we actually put in very clear written agreements with him, and he was in full agreement with us that he would have no change to his work duties or his hours for 6 months. And only after the 6 months we would be looking at doing that on a very planned basis. So we put that in writing. We dealt with it with the employer. Ben was okay with it. The employer was okay with it. Excuse me. What we didn't realize, or we didn't take into consideration well enough, was that in fact there were two other managers within this building, within this business, besides the one that we negotiated all of these arrangements with. And so there were three bosses basically. And so we put all of our efforts into working with the one that we thought was the main connection or supervisor for Ben in his position. And he even said that he would be the main person for Ben. However, what we learned was that, just a couple months into working there, these other two managers would be sort of coming in and out, and they were also playing a key role with Ben and his job. So they were really short-staffed in this particular business. Ben was doing really well. The job duties that he'd been trained on, he was really doing well at. He was very reliable for his shifts. He would be on time, he would be reliable, and that was a real asset to these employers. So of course, the other two managers who didn't have all this preliminary work and arrangements made with, they saw that they were short-staffed. Here's Ben, he's reliable, he's doing well, he's eager, and so they started to ask him if he could help them out by filling in for some extra shifts, doing some extra duties in different areas of the hotel even, like completely different environment and duties. Ben, of course, agreed. He was a new employee, he wanted to be helpful, he didn't want to rock the boat. His bosses were his bosses, and he didn't feel comfortable, I guess, saying no to them, and so he agreed, even though we had that written agreement in place. And luckily, the employment support person was still doing check-ins, not on a daily basis, but more sort of a once a week kind of check-in. And what ended up happening was that on one of the weekly check-ins, the employment support person, one of their regular questions would be, have you had any sick time or days off? Because that was sort of one of the signs that things were starting to go wrong in previous jobs. And so on one of those weekly check-ins, the employment person asked, so Ben, have you had been sick at all this week? Had any sick days? And they found out that he had. And so quickly they targeted in on that and started asking some very specific questions to find out what was going on. They also asked him, because he wasn't volunteering the information about the additional job duties, maybe because he knew that he had signed that agreement and he was worried about the employment support person not being happy with him. And so he wasn't volunteering the information. So it really was up to the employment person to pick up on that time off, sick time cue, and then ask the next important question, which is, all right, Ben, have you had any changes in your job duties? Have you had any changes in your shifts? Have any of those things changed? And when he was asked directly by the employment support person, he answered honestly, and he said, well, yeah, they were really short and they needed some extra help. They said I was doing a really good job, and so they asked if I could help out. I'm their best staff, and they needed me, and so I said okay. I didn't think it would hurt anything. And so right then, of course, the staff had to very quickly go in and talk to the other managers and explain to them and do some negotiating around, here's all the work that was put in place, here's the reasons why. He may seem like he's functioning very well, and in fact he was, with the duties and tasks that he was trained on and that we'd agreed to. But by adding extra duties on, it could very well start breaking down his work performance. And once we really started to address that with the other two managers, they seemed to be on board a little bit more, and so things got a little bit better. Unfortunately, in this case, things got better, and then about a month later, it started up again. I guess in this industry, turnover and being short-staffed is a chronic problem, and you've got this reliable guy that's doing really well. It's just natural he would be your go-to person. And so it was an issue that kept coming up, and we actually had to deal with it on more than one occasion, to the point where we had to tell the employer, if you continue to put these pressures on your employee, there's a good chance that it'll break down, and then you won't just be looking to fill the other positions or hours, you're going to be looking to fill his as well. And so it was something that we had to keep reinforcing over and over until they really sort of got it and it sunk in. So doing great, taking on too much. That can be a real pitfall from our experience, and we've had lots of examples sort of in that area. Another one is this major life changes. And so it could be all of these kinds of things, like I mentioned. I mean, these are some of the ones that we have definitely seen in our experience. New relationships, and that could be romantic relationships, or it just could be, best friends or other kinds of relationships. The relationships are complicated. They take a lot of work, they take a lot of effort, they take a lot of time. And so they're difficult for people to manage. Throwing in a new relationship at the very start of a brand new job, it can just add a lot of complication into that situation. So even though we don't want to tell people they're not allowed to have, social relationships in the beginning of their job, because that would be unreasonable, but we need to talk about the idea of taking on too many new things onto your plate at the very start of a job. One common one that we've run into more than once is a person who was either living with their parents or they were living in a supported living situation. And of course, their goal is that they really want their own place. It was one of the reasons that motivated them to come into our office and talk about employment in the first place. Because, of course, in order to move out and have your own place, you have to be able to pay the rent and afford the expenses. So if moving out was something that we know was on their radar from the beginning, it's usually something that we'll also address at the start and just say, look, moving out is a great goal to have, but we need to look at things one step at a time. So look at getting the job and making sure that the job is really stable. Talking about what is stable. Stable is more than just 3 to 6 months. And then starting to look at other big changes after that. So the one person in particular that we worked with, we knew that he was just itching to move out. In fact, when he came in for those initial meetings, it was the top of thing on his mind. Why do you want a job? I want to move out. Why do you want to work? I need money so I can move out. And so we knew that this was really important to him. We tried to come to some agreements with him that we were going to give it at least 6 months before we even talked about moving out. he never had any money to budget, and now he has some. And so it took a lot to try to convince him that a budget would be a good idea. I think he was nervous that having a budget would mean that somebody was controlling his money or telling him what he could or couldn't spend his money on. And that wasn't the intent of the budget. The intent was simply to make sure that there was a plan, and that we did it in a planned way. So the budget for him was very key. That cut out a lot of issues like the credit card, the new purchases, those kinds of things. And then the other thing was a long-term plan, long-term goals. And so we knew for a fact that moving out was one of them. We knew that he was starting to think about things like a new TV, maybe looking at his driver's license, all of these things that maybe hadn't even seemed like possibilities before he became employed, started to have some money, built up his confidence. Now these things might actually seem like possibilities for him, which is fantastic. But we need to figure out a way to help him set some realistic and manageable goals for those things. And so we talked about, let's tackle one thing at a time. Just like on how we set it up on the job, in life, we need to look at setting some goals. If your driver's license is one, let's start looking at what things you need to do in order to get there. And then let's look at what a reasonable time frame might be. So that wasn't all the employment person that did that. They sort of got the ball rolling, but we really worked with some of the other key members on his team, his other support people, life skills support person, his counselor. Those were key people that could really help him do both the budgeting and the long-term goal setting for future changes in his life. And so that was the sort of two-prong approach that ended up helping him be more successful in that job, and we avoided some pitfalls potentially. And then finally, this one of I don't need support. The reality is that the person may be feeling very empowered. They're feeling great. They're doing well on a job. They have some extra income. They're getting positive recognition. They're feeling really good about themselves. And so they might feel like, I don't need support anymore. And so one thing that we need to find a way to sort of reinforce throughout the process is that, one of the reasons why things might be going so well is because of all of this planning and preparation that's been put into place. So the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, the Disability Management Plan, this huge team that we've assembled to help through this employment process, all of these things are important. And if any of them start to fall off, or you don't start to have them as part of your support mixture anymore, that could impact the success of your job and the success that you're having. And so really kind of reinforcing that. It's not always a connection that people make. Yes, I'm doing well, but maybe the reason for that is because of all this work that's gone into it. And so we need to maintain that plan, stick with the plan, stick with the support. Don't make any substantial changes except in the view of more of a long-term context. And so certainly for those of you who are familiar with wellness recovery action plans and disability management plans, they really don't end. They really don't go away. Parts of it might change, but it's our plan for support. It's our plan for doing well. Just because we're doing well doesn't mean you throw out the plan. And so I think that that's a concept that the whole team needs to be able to reinforce. And as you're celebrating successes, one thing that we like to do, it's sort of a subtle way of reinforcing this, is you celebrate a person's success, but also make sure that you give credit to all of the planning and the supports and the team that was involved in that success, as well as the individual. So looking at that as one of the common pitfalls that we've run into. So one of the questions, if we can go to that second poll now, and look at, of those 4 pitfalls that we've just talked about in the webinar, which of the 4 pitfalls do you think might be most applicable to the folks that you're supporting? Can you see one of those 4 as being, definitely one that people you're supporting might run into? And you can click more than one. It doesn't have to just be one. But which of the 4 pitfalls do you think might be most applicable with folks that you're supporting? I'm curious to see the results of this one and just see if there are 1 or 2 that sort of stand out as higher from your experience. So far it's looking like the first and third, taking on too much and feeling like they don't need support, are a little bit higher in the lead. Definitely taking on too much seems to be the number one at the moment. Um, but certainly, oh, the work ethic issues. I hadn't tackled that one. That might be why I was thinking, I wonder why the work ethic is so much lower. It's probably because I haven't done that slide yet. Sorry about that. That number might be higher after I address that slide. I'm going to give you a few examples. But certainly you can relate to some of those pitfall issues that I've been talking about. And in fact, you've probably experienced and dealt with some of those, even if it wasn't in an employment issue. So here's that slide that I didn't get to, jumping ahead of myself, the work ethic issues. And I have some examples or stories to illustrate this that I can just very quickly tell you. One of them, when I talk about work ethic, I think about things like other coworkers in the workplace seem to be slacking off, so why can't I? So-and-so's taking lots of breaks or longer breaks, or they're sort of slacking off or not getting all their work done. So, why can't I do that? And so that's an issue that actually comes up. I mean, we've had people, a new employee who's starting to notice their other coworkers and things that they're doing. It's not uncommon for employees, and I think that if we were all honest, we would probably acknowledge the fact that we do have days where we're less productive. We have slower days. We have days where we just spend a good amount of it procrastinating or avoiding something that we don't necessarily want to have to do. But the flip side of that is that even though we might have slower, less productive days, the flip side is that we also have more productive days. So there are days when we're getting all kinds of things done, when we're crazy busy and we're just knocking all kinds of things off our to-do list. So there has to be that balance. The new employee that we're supporting, they might just see the other employees' slower days and think, oh, I can sort of step back or slow it down a bit. They don't necessarily see the flip side, where, okay, they might be having a slower day today, but that means that they have to work twice as fast tomorrow. And so we need to make sure that people see it in that context, that there will be days when maybe you're not quite as productive. We have to balance that out with other days when we're more productive. Another one is an example that's come up a few times is we have a new employee and they know that they're brand new. They don't have a whole lot of vacation time built up. If it's a percentage of their wage, they have to earn it up first. Maybe they don't get vacation in the first 6 months or year, things like that, depending on the terms of the job. But they look at another employee or another coworker and they see them taking all kinds of days off. And so it's like, hey, why can't I have extra days off? Or, I think I need to take a vacation day or a time off here. And so that can run into problems because there might be other employees that do have a lot more vacation time, but that might be for a very good reason. They may be full-time as opposed to part-time, and maybe they've worked there for a number of years. They're 10-year employees, and they naturally have built up more vacation time and more holiday time, and so the new employee might not understand those differences. And so just something as simple as being able to explain, seniority, time of employment, and vacation time and how that all works can be something that can be helpful. We've had situations where people started to think, hey, if you're taking a vacation day, I'm going to take one. And so they started going to their employer asking for all this time off when in fact they weren't eligible for it yet. So addressing those kinds of work issues or work ethic issues can just help nip things in the bud. Another one that's a common problem nowadays is cell phone use at work. Cell phones are the pain in many supervisors' sides. And for young folks coming in that are attached to these cell phones and the social media and all that, even just having the cell phone ringer turned off isn't good enough. If it's one that has an indicator light or that vibrates, people are not going to be able to help but be distracted by some of those things. So it would be wise to really start to anticipate if you can and set up some very clear processes around use of cell phone at work. Make things very black and white is always the better option. Don't leave gray areas around that. Don't leave it to we'll see. We'll see if it's an issue and then we'll deal with it. If you think that it might be, it's always better just to make it very cut and dry, very black and white right from the start. And then hanging out when not working. That's another one. The person is loving their new job. They're doing well. They've got some good friends, some colleagues. It's a social time. They're really enjoying being at work. And all of a sudden they start to come extra early, or they start hanging out after work or on their days off. And this happens. This can happen with typical employees as well. But we need to have those sort of clear boundaries around working time and personal time and that sort of thing. So sometimes that can be an issue. And I'll just end with one, somewhat humorous story that we ran into, a case study where we had a young man who was working in a warehouse, and he had a warehouse job. It was a really cool sort of guy's job. He didn't have to worry about his dress. He could wear sort of his grubby, comfortable clothes, and that was cool for him. He didn't like to have to dress up. The guys were kind of rough and tough in the warehouse. They were a little bit raw around the edges, and this guy just fit in really well with that. But one of the things that started to happen is the employer, one of the check-ins by the employment support person, the employer started to mention that, well, yeah, John's he's starting to come in really early. He's coming in like an hour or 2 hours even before his shift, and he's just sort of hanging out in the staff room a lot, and just it's a bit odd. He doesn't need to be here that early. And so when our employment staff started to look into just what was going on, what was happening, why was he coming in so early? Because definitely you shouldn't be coming in an hour or 2 hours before your job. They started to just problem solve with him, and at first he wasn't really volunteering a lot of information, but it ended up, to make a long story short, that in this warehouse job, one of the features of the staff room was that there was a collection of adult related or adult magazines in the staff room, and it turns out that this fellow had found this stash of they weren't a stash, it wasn't hidden, it was mostly men working in this warehouse, and so they were fairly open and upfront about it. So they had this collection of magazines in there, and this fellow just started to get used to the idea of coming in and having a read of some magazines before his shift started. That time started to get a little bit longer and a little bit earlier, and he was spending a bit more time getting a bit preoccupied with these, and so we just had to have some discussions with him about the work behavior and work ethics and things like that. And after a couple of discussions with him, the issue went away. It wasn't a problem. He started coming in more at a more appropriate time, and it was just dealt with. It was something that maybe the employer wasn't comfortable dealing with him, and so it was good that we were able to go in and just deal with that at an early stage. So job retention, there can be all kinds of things that can crop up. I think a lot of them we can anticipate with practice, with successes, with our failures. We learn what to do and what not to do. And I hope that some of those were helpful and just gave you some extra parts to think about as you're going through this process. If we have any questions, we do have a few minutes left before the end of the session, and so you can feel free to type in some questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Any comments also welcome on your experiences. While people are thinking of all of their great questions to type, I just wanted to reinforce what Matt was saying about your evaluation comments. We really appreciate them. There is a very sort of formal evaluative process going on with these webinars, so we want to be able to see if they were helpful, if they were successful, so any comments you have after we'd really appreciate. We had a question, do you have any examples of a pre-employment agreement? As you'll know if you were in some of the previous sessions, I usually like to have some samples and examples to give to people, but in this particular case, as I was trying to think of a sample or